next speaker is Byrd from TBI, and he's going to share a law enforcement perspective on human trafficking. Thank you, Brian.
Good afternoon, everyone. As she said, my name is Brian Byrd. I'm an ASAC with TBI. I'm a supervisory agent equivalent to Margie, who developed this PowerPoint that you're going to see today. Margie runs our criminal intelligence unit in Nashville. Her unit is responsible for keeping up with trends in criminal activity all across the state, gang activity, violent crime, all those different things. When it came down for a need to check into human trafficking, Margie was, of course, called upon to once again perform her magic and try to make a determination as to what's going on across the state with human trafficking, and she has developed this information that you will see today, and it's an awesome presentation. She and her unit's done a very good job. As I said, I'm a supervisor in Jackson. I supervise the drug unit, and I've had about 20-something years of experience, 24 at TBI this year. I've worked in the Medicaid fraud control unit. I worked about 12 years in the 24th Judicial District doing victim crime, where I worked several cases involving domestic violence. In fact, several of these testimonials that we heard earlier brought back a flood of memories of cases that I had worked and victims where I sat across from a lady who recounted the horrible things that had happened to her just prior, or in some instances where I've had to collect the remains of women who were victims of domestic abuse. So this is a very serious subject, certainly not lost on me. I have seen it firsthand too many times. As for human trafficking, I would like to say this is, of course, focused upon the human sex trafficking, but this is a growing trend in America, and we're going to have to watch out for it. On the drug side, it's very common for drug organizations to enslave or basically they lure people into a situation of wanting to come to America from usually someplace like Mexico or other countries, and then they use them to haul in the dope across the border. Sometimes I've interviewed people who have been given, a gallon of water and a milk jug and 20 or 30 pounds of marijuana and 10 pounds of methamphetamine and dropped out in the desert in Mexico and told to walk to Texas, and someone would pick them up eventually. That's one of the aspects of human trafficking. So it's a little broader than just this, but this is probably, I think, the worst that I've seen in terms of the different kinds of trafficking. Margie knows this is her passion, knows it by heart. I've given presentations too. I'll say this to y'all. I've given presentations before, and I'm no stranger to it, but I've not given this presentation. So if I get past my time, feel free to step in and let me know. I don't want to keep you guys here too long. As you can see, this is one of the typical aspects of the person involved in the trafficking. We're going to see adults and minors involved in presenting a sex act. It could be male or female, doesn't matter. Before, and I know as a child in the movies, we've always kind of been presented that, a prostitute, they were there by choice, or maybe they really enjoyed their job. They always tried to soften it for the public when they presented in the media or the film industry. But what you're going to see in this presentation today is most of these people are beaten, they're enslaved, they're kept locked in rooms, they are denied every privilege that you could imagine, including eating, until they begin to perform for the master, the pimp, or whatever you want to call him, and then they're built back up to serve in the function that he or she deems necessary. Now, we've all been familiar with gang activity. Unfortunately, Tennessee's no stranger to gangs, like most states. So The Criminal Intelligence Unit was called upon by the legislature to come up with a study on gangs and their activities in Tennessee. And you can see by the red chart on the screen the counties where we had major gang activity. And these were determined by the statistics that Margie and her group collected. In a similar study, the governor's office asked TBI to try to make a determination about human trafficking. And look at the surprise here. The blue counties, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. The blue counties represent gang activity, and the red counties represent reports of human sex trafficking. So we actually have more reports, at least on a county-by-county basis, of human sex trafficking than we do violent gang activity. We're just becoming known to this as a problem, obviously, in the last 4 to 5 years, and we're all going to have to be more diligent in paying attention and reporting these things. I can remember when gangs first started to make an appearance in the early 90s across Tennessee. I was part of that, making those identifications and those reports. In the late 90s, when methamphetamine began to appear and the clandestine labs began to show up in Tennessee, those things became a trend. We had clan labs here that we didn't know were here because we didn't know to look for them. Well, the same thing's happening here with human trafficking. We've got human trafficking going on. We're just not identifying it and doing something about it. Well, we're starting to, but we haven't been to this point. All right, this report, minor human sex trafficking is present in Tennessee. 35% of all entities reporting the state that they have reported or investigated minor human sex trafficking over the last 24 months. There were 16 entities that actually had in excess of 50 cases. 8 reported over 100 cases within the state. Of course, these would be sheriff's departments, city police departments, those kind of entities where they would be filing reports with our reporting system. 68 counties representing 72% of the total counties in the state reported at least one case of minor human sex trafficking. The following 4 counties reported more than 100: Shelby, Davidson, Coffee, and Knox. Now, Coffee really stands out. Knox, Davidson, and Shelby, big cities, right? So you would expect probably a little more criminal activity in some of the larger populations. But Coffee is probably about the size of Gibson County. Not very much different. The problem is as far as my understanding is, there's a group home for females there where they're abused or neglected in some form, and they're sent there for treatment. So basically what you have are offenders who are recruiting out of that group home, and they're using those women that are coming out of there and bringing them right back into, putting them into a trafficking organization. Now, the law enforcement is now aware of that. That's one of the things that come out of this study. I know they're trying to obviously make a response to that, and hopefully we can get that number back down. Obviously, as I said before, of the 21 counties included in the new report, 17 of the highest are rural counties. I know from personal experience, when we're out on surveillance or doing other investigative activities, it's very common for us now to run into prostitutes and things. We have to take special note to make sure we're kind of IDing those people, following up. We want to see who they're involved with, but it's definitely occurring out there. As you might imagine, just like with the drug problem or anything else, sex trafficking has no geographic, economic, or social boundaries. Unfortunately, as I've heard from many of the testimonials earlier today, most of the victims of this, the people that end up in this situation, they already have very low self-esteem. And that doesn't really relate to how wealthy you are or where you come from. That's more of a domestic issue within the home. So anyone could be a victim of this. Minors who come from impoverished households may be especially vulnerable. Obviously, they have a much harder time making it than some of us that are able to provide more for our children. You can see on this the basic layout of the percentage of minors who live under the poverty line in the past 12 months, and how it's laid out across the state. I was not personally involved in this case, but approximately 4 years ago, we successfully prosecuted a young adult for having sex with 4 minor girls. He was suspected of procuring these girls for prostitution. This was in a rural community where the kids and adults began to talk. The victim seemed displeased because of the stigma. This was actually in Lake County, as it said. And I can see how that would be an issue. Many of you have dealt with victims in domestic abuse and other things where people don't want to come forward, they don't want to talk about the things that have happened to them. One of the things that I can remember is when I was involved in victim crime were sex-related offenses. A lot of times your victims were not the best, as has been pointed out, they're not the best witnesses. They don't really want to be there. And it's very difficult, traumatic experience to put them on the stand and to talk about what has happened or what they've done or have done to them. Focus groups had an overwhelming response that law enforcement, prosecutors, and social services are not adequately trained. I can honestly say that I never really thought about human trafficking in this respect until about 4 or 5 years ago. And I think now, thanks to hearings like this and in other formats, we're able to start training law enforcement and our social services to try to make a response to this. As I say, human trafficking has been around, but I never really considered personally that we were having young women enslaved in our state. That just seems unacceptable to me. Obviously, money is always an issue with government activities. So far, the cost to train first reporters, which are basically your frontline law enforcement people, is roughly about $35 a person. This is coming out to about $750,000. So it is a costly factor that you could add into your cost of violence against women. We have 8 hours of post-certified training for our officers now. We offer regional trainings. So far, as you can see, we've had about 4,700 participants trained since they started this program. During the 2013 legislative session, Tennessee made significant steps in becoming one of the top states in the nation with the strongest anti-human trafficking legislation. I got to say that thanks to our legislature, their response to the reports that Margie and others have come up with, you can see they've listed a number of new legislative House bills that are making these offenses far more punitive for the people involved in this. And it also, as Judge Snyder pointed out, it freed up the fact that some of these young girls were being forced into prostitution, and it reduced that idea that they are actually committing a criminal offense. That way they don't have to feel ashamed or afraid to come to report what's going on to an officer. I guess that's all that she has. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much. I have heard Margie at several hearings now speak about this, and a couple things I point out. I think Lake County, because it's in this area, it's interesting in the fact that they had such a high level of sexual trafficking. And I asked her about that, and she believes, I think, that it's connected with the poverty level there being so high.
That's very likely. We also noticed from our intelligence reports we have active gang activities there associated with Dyer and some of the other counties, O'Brien, in that region. I think the gangs are notorious for organized criminal activity, and that fits within this rubric. So it's very likely you put those two together. Right. I think it makes for an environment like that. And that could be just as probable in, say, another county similar to it. If you went to Claiborne County in Upper East Tennessee, or Cocke County, or some of the other counties across the state, Grundy, you put those rough economic conditions involved, and then you put the right people in the right places, and you've got a big problem.
Right, thank you. And the other thing I'd say is that she said that a lot of us have, I think, the mistaken opinion that many of the victims are from other countries, that maybe they're Hispanic or they're Asian, and in fact, in Tennessee, they are Tennesseans.
Yes. Very commonly, we're seeing runaways, people who maybe have left their home for various reasons, perhaps abuse or other issues, perhaps drug use, but they feel unwanted or unloved sometimes. And I think these individuals, they know how to find those girls. They see them in a bar, or they see them in a social setting somewhere, and they pull them out and isolate them, and then start talking to them and use that as a way to recruit them. And then they bring them in to a situation where they're, locked away somewhere in an apartment, and they begin the process of turning them. It's very, and she didn't put this in the presentation, but it's very disturbing to me that you can look up on the internet, and there are books that teach you how to do this to humans. Amazon and other organizations that sell things like that on the internet are providing those books. And I know that this is a First Amendment society, but there's just something basically wrong with that. It's just unacceptable to do that to another person. We should live in a safe environment, and our children need to be in a safe environment.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Yes.
I know the laws we passed last time, I was able to sign on to a couple of those laws. In a perfect world, in your dream world, what would be one piece of legislation you would love to see passed next year?
With respect to human trafficking, I think that we could grade the offenses, perhaps, for the madam or the pimp, or for lack of a better word, the facilitator who's doing it. I think that they should serve mandatory 85% sentences. I don't know if they're, and grade the offense based on the trauma to the victims and the number of victims, perhaps, so that they'd have to serve longer sentences for the things that they would do, that they're doing to these people. Because I feel like over the long term, once they've learned this as a skill, we have to offer a deterrent so that they would never want to use that skill again.
Thank you, Brian, Agent Byrd. We really appreciate you coming and sharing this with us. Thank you.